After the challenges of the 1960s and 70s and a lot of the social turmoil and change that happened during that time, many people distrusted government. And so, as you know, conservatives rise to power in the 1980s. But to really understand this change, it's important to ask yourself the question, who do you trust more, big government or big business? People that tend to be more conservative, especially in regards to economics and who's handling their tax money, believe really strongly that big businesses are more trustworthy and predictable than government. And by big government, we mean government with more power to tax and spend. Many people, especially conservatives, feel strongly that big businesses are more predictable because they are governed by the desire for profit. And so they're not going to make irresponsible financial choices. And so people feel more comfortable putting trust in big business. And so that's sort of the philosophy that takes over in the 1980s. So now we're going to learn about Reaganomics and Conservatives. Reaganomics is obviously a made-up word to describe President Reagan's theory of economics. So what we see in the 1980s is a renewed focus on family values. You can see here that there is an association with the Republican Party and God and religion, and specifically Christianity and conservative American values. The Moral Majority was a political organization that motivated people to vote for conservatives and to refocus on family values. And this was effective in the 1980s. By family values, they mean moving away from talking about sexuality so openly, moving back towards more conservative views of family and having a mom at home and available and accessible to children, having hardworking American families that have integrity and are honest and support one another. These are conservative family values. And so when you hear family values in politics today, you should really think about family values as meaning rather more conservative values. The Moral Majority, this political organization, led to a tide of conservatives taking office. And so under President Reagan, he has a tremendous amount of Republican support in the House and in the Senate. This is a map of the 1980 presidential election. And you can see that in red is typically the color used to characterize Republicans, and blue is typically the color used to characterize Democrats. You can see that President Carter, who was the incumbent in this election, incumbent meaning he was currently the president, did not win very many states. And so the popular vote was much closer than it looks there. Carter had 41% of the popular vote. But in terms of the Electoral College, President Reagan took 90% of Electoral College votes, meaning he won the majority in almost every state, with a couple exceptions here: Minnesota, Georgia, West Virginia, and Maryland. So our nation, and Hawaii, I should also mention, our nation looks very, very red, and this is a huge contrast to what our nation looked like, say, under FDR, where the nation was almost entirely voting Democratic. So between World War II and the New Deal reforms and the support that we felt for the president during World War II and 1980, so in 40 years, we go from being pretty much an entirely blue country to being a very, very red country. So Reaganomics. This is supply-side economics. It is a school of macroeconomic theory, and basically they argue that economic growth can be most effectively created by lowering barriers for people to produce or supply goods and services, as well as invest in capital. So, this is an economic theory. It's macroeconomics, macro being large-scale, nationwide economics, not like personal finance or individual businesses, but in terms of governmental policy related to economics. Reagan's theory is that if we take away all the barriers, all the taxes, all the regulations, and maybe not all, but as many as possible, taxes and regulations, all these barriers that can prevent people from producing as much as possible, we will have a more booming economy. So this is essentially the opposite of, say, Robin Hood's theory, which is take from the rich and give to the poor. Reagan is saying, no, don't take from the rich. Let the rich be rich, because what the rich are going to do is they are going to reinvest. And Reagan puts trust in the rich to reinvest. He feels strongly that the rich are rich because they're obviously good at handling money. So we want those people to be handling our nation's money. Our government isn't good at handling money. Our government makes silly economic choices, in his opinion. And so what he does is he wants to make it so that the rich don't have to pay as much taxes. The rich don't have as many regulations on their businesses. And by rich, we can extend this to corporations. We want to make it so that they can keep getting richer. And the theory behind that is that as the rich get richer, they will be able to hire more people. Their businesses will get bigger as a result. They will produce more goods, and as we produce more goods, there will be more things available for people to buy. There will be more jobs for people to have to produce those things so that they can buy the more things that we produce. So this theory is essentially called, it has another word, it's called trickle-down economics. And it's the theory that as the people at the top get richer, the poor at the bottom will also get richer as a result. So you may have heard the phrase, a rising tide raises all ships. And the idea here is that as the rich are raising up and getting wealthier, the ships will also come up with them. And so this is very different than, say, demand-side economics, where basically if people don't want something, you shouldn't produce it. He's saying, no, we got to keep producing. We got to require, we got to push big businesses to keep producing. And it was sort of a change in mindset about economics. It also changes our mindset about the role of government. What the New Deal era brought in is this idea that the government is supposed to fix the problems in the economy. And Reaganomics said bad businesses will fail. They will go bankrupt, and that's okay. Obviously, they're not doing well enough. And so we want to take away all the barriers to freedom of trade. It's similar to laissez-faire, but a little bit different, because Reagan still believes in some regulations, but he's moving us more towards things that might take away money for businesses. You might think about it this way. If the government takes money out of your paycheck, that means you have less money to spend. And a lot of times we think of spending our money as just spending money, but what we don't realize is we're investing. We're investing in food, we're investing in clothing, we're investing in shoes. Each time you spend money, you're investing. And so he wants to keep the government from taking away investment opportunities for the people. Now, there are some major criticisms to Reaganomics and trickle-down theory, and some of those criticisms are that sometimes that doesn't happen. The rich just get richer and they keep their money, and it doesn't trickle down to the poor effectively. Reagan, what he does when he comes into office is he tries to cut taxes as much as possible, and so there's a lot of tax cuts that happen. Reagan also goes through and tries to cut spending on the safety nets that were put in during the New Deal era. So cut spending to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, different shelters and different things like that are essentially programs to take money from the people that are paying their taxes and give that money to the poor people through social programs. So Reagan goes through and he changes a lot of that. Reagan argued that tax cuts are incentives for individuals and businesses to work and produce. And so it's important to remember that this is really the opposite of a Robin Hood-esque theory. One of the things that he did, and sort of a symbol of Reaganomics, was the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which was passed in 1981, shortly after he becomes president. The ERTA included a 25% reduction in tax rates for individuals and indexed for inflation. So as inflation goes up, that percent reduction in tax rates will continue to go up with it. It cut tax rates on high-income taxpayers, so people that have high incomes, rich people. It cut taxes on them from 70 to 30%, and it would be the defining economic legacy of Reagan's presidency. The rich love Reagan's policy, and because it allows them to keep more of their money. Taxes were higher on wealthy people during the 1950s than they ever have been since. And taxes for the wealthy continue to go down depending on, or continue to fluctuate depending on who's in office and which party is controlling the legislature. But they seem to be staying pretty low. In fact, during the last election, Warren Buffett spoke out pretty adamantly. He's a billionaire in the United States, and he spoke out pretty adamantly, saying that he was pretty aggravated that he pays less in taxes than his secretary does. So a lot of times the burden of paying taxes falls on the middle class, which is one of the biggest arguments against Reaganomics. Rich make jobs, so don't tax them. It's kind of the opposite of Robin Hood. And there are a lot of people that are in favor of Reaganomics. You'll hear a lot in the news and in the media. We need to return to Reagan-era tax cuts, Reagan-era policies. This was sort of the golden era. And unfortunately for Reagan, and unfortunately for his critics, there is a major economic boom that happens, maybe perhaps as a result of new technologies like computers and other things that come in and change our economy, change the dynamic of our economy. But it also could be largely because of some of Reagan's tax cuts and business plans. The picture here is of Reagan signing the Economic Recovery Tax Act at his home in California. Some of the major opponents to Reagan-era tax cuts were environmentalists. The Sagebrush Rebellion was a similar thing, so conservationists got pretty upset with some of the different trends that were going on during the Reagan era. Sagebrush rebels wanted the federal government to give more control of federally owned Western lands to state and local authorities. So this is another way that people were going about trying to reduce the role of big government and shift things back to private businesses or private individuals. Take the land that is currently held and regulated by the federal government and give it to individuals or state authorities. The idea here was to increase the growth of Western economies, allow individual people to work the land and use the resources that are on land, such as the one pictured here. And they called themselves the Sagebrush Rebels, wanting to take the land back from the government and power to the people, that type of thing. But so Reagan declared himself a Sagebrush Rebel, perhaps as a political maneuver or otherwise. But in a campaign speech, actually in Salt Lake City, he says, "I happen to be one who cheers and support the Sagebrush Rebellion. Count on me as a rebel, or count me in as a rebel." Conservationists oppose this movement because conservationists want the government to control land federally or on a state level, as high up as we can get it, because when individuals own the land, they're going to use the land for profit. And conservationists and environmentalists argue that we don't want people to use the land for profit. We want people to use the land responsibly, and the only way that that can be managed effectively is if the government does that. So that was some of the major opposition to the Sagebrush Rebellion. KCV Planned Parenthood is shows some of the success of a lot of this family values movement. In 1992, KCV Planned Parenthood was a major Supreme Court case. Planned Parenthood is an organization that provides health care to women, especially sexual health care. And so different things like access to contraception, education about contraception and sex and sexually transmitted diseases, different things like that. But the biggest criticism of Planned Parenthood is that they are basically an abortion clinic, if I were to put it in the most negative light I can. KCV Planned Parenthood was a Supreme Court ruling which affirmed the basic ruling of Roe v. Wade, that the state is prohibited from banning most abortions. So it upheld this idea that you cannot just ban abortions, that abortions are legal. So it upholds that part of Roe v. Wade. But however, it added that states may regulate abortions. And so this was where the whole, this is sort of a defeat of pro-choice women and or advocates. They say that they can regulate abortions to protect the health of the mother. So if the health of the mother is in jeopardy, then they're allowed to regulate when abortions are given. If the life of the fetus is in jeopardy, that's another way where abortions can be regulated. And also, they can outlaw abortions if the fetus is viable. And what that means is if the fetus is able to live on its own. And so that has to do with how many weeks this pregnancy has been going on. So what this led to was a lot of states starting to pass regulations that limited women's access to abortion. And so if you're looking at the extremes related to abortions, some extreme liberals saying abortions should be legal at any point. It's the woman's body. She has the choice, and she should be able to do that whenever she wants. That's on one extreme. And then the other extreme being, the conception, you are a person. Personhood is established at the moment of conception, the moment sperm touches egg. And so if that's the case, this is a major victory because Roe v. Wade is saying abortion is legal. And now what KCV Planned Parenthood is doing is limiting how legal abortion is. In 1996, another victory for family values, a act called DOMA, which stands for the Defense of Marriage Act, is passed. This was signed in 1996 by Democratic President Bill Clinton, and what it did, it was a very short act. It was barely a paragraph, and it basically defined marriage as between a man and a woman. And on the surface, this might not seem too terribly, except the intent of this act is to discriminate against homosexuals and bar them from the marriage. President Bill Clinton, while this is maybe a dark spot on his presidency from the perspective of his liberal base as a Democrat, he later, in the early 2000s, later issued a statement where he regretted signing this bill into law. And so I think that's an important point for understanding Bill Clinton. He was under a great deal of pressure during his presidency, and we will talk about that at a later date, but under a great deal of pressure to deal with the fact that both the House and the Senate in his presidency were strongly Republican. So while he was a Democrat, he was dealing with a split presidency or a split government.